duration of Kabbalah and coffee in Kabbalah. It is 11th of Nisan, 5786, Sunday, March 12th. No one really knows for sure. Elubay, Eludivre, Elokim, Chaim, but this is the Muslim lived by. 3761. Creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava. 3631. 130. Seth, son of Adam, was born. Well, this should start now. I'm gonna get my coffee.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Judaism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive of Jewish mysticism, and this class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are, admittedly, as they are, obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series on the playlist entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism by joining my Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Alright, folks, welcome back. Some more Shabbatite V excitement. We're really going to get into some of the more technical stuff around Shabbatite V, and we're going to talk about what was at some level a very freaking dominant movement in the Jewish world in the middle of the 16th, 17th century. And eventually how he would think that the death of his prophet, Nathan of Gaza, would have spelled the end for the entire movement. But as you probably know, dying is not really an impediment for Messiahs. Messiahs die all the time. Their believers keep on believing in them as if nothing happened, whether it's Jesus of Nazareth or Menachem Mendel Schneerson of blessed memory. People continue to believe in their Messiah's death is just a speed bump on the way to eternity. And so we'll turn to that and how the Shabbatian movement continued after Shabbatai's death, and how it thrived all the way probably at least into the 1880s, maybe even later than that, especially in Turkey. Although we don't what its status is these days. So what is the recap for tonight? Well, the recap is there was a guy in the 17th century that believed he was the Messiah and so had a world of Jews. That's the recap. There was a guy, Shabbatai Tzvi, who was declared the Messiah by a relative novelist and healer in Gaza, Nathan of Gaza, Nelson Gazaki, and he was declared Messiah in 1665, although he had messianic pretensions as early as 1648. And between 1665 and 1666, half the world seemed to have accepted his messianic claims. And this is evidenced by the most classic example of evidence for this is the prayer books that get printed. The prayer books that have pictures of Shabbatai Tzvi in them. The prayer books that have prayers for Shabbatai Tzvi. The letters that come over and over again from major rabbinical figures all over the Jewish world that affirm belief in Shabbatai Tzvi as the Messiah. And we talked a bit last time about the life of Shabbatai Tzvi, the ups and downs of his life, Nathan of Gaza, and things like this. So we talked a bit about the life and times of Shabbatai Tzvi. But what we didn't get into last time is exactly how he's supposed to be the Messiah. How does that work exactly, right? What exactly does it mean to say Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah? And how this dovetails in a really important way as a part of our discussions here on Kabbalah is that one can only understand the messianic claims of Shabbatai Tzvi or of Nathan of Gaza by understanding how that was justified. And that was justified by Kabbalah, basically. It was justified, it was underwritten by Kabbalah. The Kabbalah enabled Nathan of Gaza and its son Shabbatai Tzvi to develop this messianic story. Shabbatai Tzvi to claim that he was the Messiah for Nathan of Gaza to greatly popularize his messianic claims. Now, there's a couple of things to know that are important about Shabbatai Tzvi and how they're quite different in relationship to Kabbalah. But really important to know is that they don't really have the same education. Shabbatai Tzvi is kind of a yeshiva dropout. He's very talented. He's very smart, and of course he's very charismatic, more charismatic than anything else, I suspect. But Shabbatai Tzvi doesn't have a very strong grasp on Kabbalah. He certainly knows the Zohar very well. We know that. He's been studying the Zohar since he was a teenager. So he has a strong grasp on the Zohar, but the developments in the Kodeverim system of Kabbalah, the developments in the world of Sfat, the world of Kabbalah, there's actually very little evidence that Shabbatai Tzvi had a grasp of those developments. He doesn't seem to understand or appreciate or have had education in the very complex world of Luri and Kabbalah. So we have just a difference in education level when it comes to Kabbalah and Shabbatai Tzvi and Nathan of Gaza. Now, Nathan of Gaza, which is really important to know about Nathan of Gaza, is he is hyper aware of the developments in Luri and Kabbalah. And I mean hyper aware, he is so well educated that if you read some of his Kabbalistic works, which are among the most technical Kabbalistic texts written at the time, very subtle differences between different schools of Kabbalah. So he even knows differences between how very technical ideas in Luri and Kabbalah are being debated by high-level people in that world, for instance. People like Israel Saru, Paul. Nathan of Gaza is someone who knows these conversations. He is a technical maestro when it comes to the developments. He's at the cutting edge at some level of some of these developments. And it's going to be really important because how Nathan of Gaza is going to justify Shabbatai Tzvi's messianic claims are going to be by appealing to and what's the right word? Augmenting, changing, corrupting, whatever word you want to use. He's going to be relying heavily on Luri and going to do his own thing too. He's going to do his own thing. We'll see this in just a moment. Shabbatai, for his messianic claims, which we can see in letters, just appealing to complex ideas in Luri and Kabbalah, he doesn't know much about it. He's claiming that he's the Messiah because God chose him and because he has a relationship with God. That is to say, Shem and Shabbatai are friends. So when Shabbatai calls God by God's Yotei Shabbatai doesn't imagine he's doing something transgressive. He knows he's not supposed to do it. But he has this intense personal relationship with God that he can call God by God's name. So for him, for Shabbatai, it has nothing to do with some Kabbalistic logical stuff. It has to do with the fact that God and Shabbatai are close. He and God have a relationship. And that relationship is one of anointing. I've been invited into the world of Godhead, and I have a relationship with Hashem. Now, to you might sound really Christian. That might sound really, really Christian to you. In fact, one of the things that Shabbatai talks about is Christianity. He talks about Jesus. He says, one of the things I'm going to do in this whole messianic business is redeem Jesus. He's very influenced at some level. And part of what I think makes the Jewish world very uncomfortable with Shabbatai is not his transgressive behavior. His transgressive behavior gets really overplayed for reasons we'll talk about later. But it's not his transgressive behavior, it's his syncretism. That he's okay of incorporating Christian elements, with incorporating secular elements, with incorporating Islamic elements. That's what worries the Jewish establishment, syncretism, that makes them really angry. Of course, he does these transgressive things, and that pisses them off too. But really, it's the syncretism that really gets him. And I think that's something that's come new in the scholarship. And we were just talking about this before the recording started, is that what's going on now in the scholarship, we're now beginning to realize that Tzvi was much more a helm of understanding than the previous generation of scholarship, mostly Gershom Scholem, thought. Scholem basically thought that at some level, Shabbatai Tzvi was a yeshiva dropout who had no real understanding of Judaism, much Kabbalah, and that he was a mentally ill person that rode on the coattails. That was the theory that really Scholem's work. That's the theory that goes. More recent scholarship, the Leeds and other kind of folks, Pavel Machenko, we really now know that's not true. Because we have been explaining why he thinks he's the Messiah. And he gives very different reasons for why he thinks he's the Messiah, as opposed to why I've got to think he is. So we're getting a much more complicated vision of who Shabbatai was, his theology, his ideas of his own Messiah. We're getting those ideas, and this shows you that the scholarship is continuing to evolve. Get into Nathan of Gaza's theory, right? Let's get into Nathan of Gaza's theory, because that's going to really tie us back to the Kabbalah in a big way. So what does Nathan of Gaza think? Why does Nathan of Gaza think that Shabbat? So it has everything to do with Lurianic Kabbalah. So just to rewind a little bit, right? You'll remember from the Lurianic theory that God was originally an infinite fullness, and that fullness filled the entire everything. And that in order to create creation, God had to contract God's self, and that act of contraction is called tzimtzum. Well, when God contracted God's self into the things behind a void, what we call the Tehiru in Hebrew, and the Tehiru, right, when it was evacuated, according to the Lurianic Kabbalah, it left behind traces of the divine. There are sort of fragments of God left behind. I always imagine, you ever poured out oil, like a cooking pan? There's always oil left, no matter how much you tip it over, you can't oil out. The traces of the divine life, the Rishimu, coated or fragmented all over inside of the Tehiru, of the void. Well, some of those aspects of those traces within the divine void contain of divine judgment. Remember, divine judgment in the Kabbalah is always thought of when divine judgment isn't checked by other forces, that is evil. It's unbridled judgment. Deen. Well, those elements of deen, of unbridled judgment that remain of the Tehiru, which are the void, elements of unbridled judgment and judgment, they sank to the bottom of that void. And as they sank to the bottom of that void, those elements became the sort of the abyss, or sort of the demonic world at the bottom of that void, of the gap that when God zoomed. That area, by the way, is called the Golem, and in Kabbalah, it's called the Golem. It's the unformed world. It's just chaos. It's a tohu vabohu. It's this chaotic nightmare where all is sunk to the bottom of the void. All right. So when God shoots God's that void, at the very tip of that spear at the very tip of Yesod, at the tip of God's malice, I suppose, at the tip of God's Yesod, the tip of that sphere that light plunges all the way in to the void, to the Tehillim, and the tip of that, and this is where Nathan of Gaza comes in. It's not Lurianic Kabbalah. Nathan of Gaza, the tip of that shoots all the way into the very bottom of the void of this where demons are, and the tip of that is the soul of the Messiah. The soul of the Messiah is the tip of the spear, the tip of the light going all the way in. As soon as it reaches the bottom, it comes back up, and all of God's remaining judgment in Ein Sof floods into the void, the demonic abyss, the golem, and the soul of the Messiah is the only thing good left at the bottom of that chaotic, nightmarish abyss of evil. And the soul of the Messiah is born, is deposited in Gaza at the very bottom of the abyss. And that abyss is filled with every form of evil imaginable. Every form of evil imaginable. The soul of the Messiah, born there, put there. And there, the soul of the Messiah becomes infused with all this evil. And it's only through this unimaginable process where the soul of the Messiah has to redeem itself, has to climb out of this horrifying abyss of evil, that in the process of redeeming itself, eventually it pulls itself all the way up, right through this horrific world of what is called the Tanaim dragons of the text that describes this. It's called the Treatise on Dragons. As the Messiah's soul fights vigorously, strives vigorously to purify itself, re-purify itself of all this evil, eventually the soul of the Messiah reaches sort of the event horizon, right? If you want to think about this in terms of a black hole, it's like a black hole, but eventually the soul of the Messiah can get to the very top of the event horizon, right? And just barely pop through. Now, when it barely pops through this horrific world of demonic power, it'll corrupt it deeply with demonic power. Completely, it's still infused with evil. And so it's still some battle of good and evil. It's still deeply polarized between good, it's the soul of the Messiah, and really, really bad, right? Evil world of cards. And as it cloud eventually crosses back through the event horizon of evil, which you can't do with the black hole, but it crosses through, and it still influences all its evil, but as soon as it climbs out of the world of the clothes, it has to find the body. And when it finds the body, the soul root that finds the body, it found the body, according to Nathan of Gaza, of poor Shabbatai Tzvi. And folks, that explains Shabbatai Tzvi. That explains these, according to Nathan of Gaza, these illuminations and these darkness periods, this sort of manic behavior, manic depression. It explains why he can be completely right God and yet do these transgressive things, where he says that the 17th Tammuz or whatever is a feast day rather than a fast. And it's exactly Shabbatai's manic depressive psychology and manic depressive religiosity that for Nathan of Gaza is actually proof of his messianicness. Because inside of Shabbatai is the struggle of the messianic soul against the world of evil, and for Nathan of Gaza, this entire process is the final act of history. Once Shabbatai is purified of all of this evil, then everything will be redeemed. He is embodying, according to Nathan of Gaza, he embodies this final struggle of good and evil. Now, what did the apostasy mean, right? Because again, Nathan of Gaza was formulated in 65. Nathan of Shabbatai apostatizes in 666. Well, we have two completely different theories about what's going on here. We have Nathan's theory. Shabbatai is plunging himself into the world that is to say Gentile religion. Nathan of Gaza has nothing good to say about the Gentiles. He's plunging himself in the world of evil in order to basically undermine it. That is to say, he's destroying it from the inside. Nathan of Gaza's theology is always the idea that Shabbatai is plunging himself into this to destroy it. He's going to make a double agent in the world of he's not really apostatizing, he's pretending to apostatize, to plunge himself into this world, to undermine it, to destroy the code. What we now know from Shabbatai's letters, right, we have another view, which again is actually Shabbatai's view. Shabbatai also thought he was the Messiah. Shabbatai's view was that he was actually plunging himself into this in order to redeem Islam. He thought of himself as a redeemer. He wasn't going into Islam to destroy it. He thought there was positive things in Islam. He thought there was positive things in Christianity. And the idea was that ultimately, by plunging himself into this, by plunging himself into Islam, he could redeem the world of the Muslims, and that will be part of the grand redemption. Notice they're very, very different theories. Notice that what Nathan thought was happening is one thing, and what Shabbatai happens is something completely different. So notice here, even the Shabbatian movement isn't coherent in terms of what they thought was happening in terms of Shabbatai's messianic mission. And that's not surprising, because if you look at early Christianity, it's not clear that early Christianity really understood what Jesus' mission was. And there was a huge debate about that. Paul thought one thing, James thought another, something else. It's not clear that Jesus' mission was X, Y, or Z. And so that's why I ditto with the Shabbatian movement. Key about this, right, is we have three important interlocking things that make this important. The first is all of them agree that whatever Messiah means, it does not mean the traditional idea of Messiah, which we talked about last time, which is the idea of a political Messiah. This is a spiritualization, the same thing that the Jesus movement did with Jesus, the Shabbatian movement does with Shabbatai, ditto with, I'm sure it's on a bus. Further, we have this quasi-Lurianic justification for Shabbatai's claims. Now, what to note about these sort of quasi-messianic justifications for Shabbatai's messianic claims is that they're going to be the ones that largely stick. Now, it's the case that some Shabbatians have some letters of Shabbatai, but usually what's going to stick is going to be the Lurianic, quasi-Lurianic, re-Lurianic, because a lot of this is not Luria, this is even of God, that's sort of riffing on Luria. Riffing on Luria is a kind way to put it. But yeah, riffing on Luria. And third, this is all part of a larger apocalyptic agenda, as we mentioned last time. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. The 17th century, the mid-17th century, was an age of hyper-apocalypticism. I mean, folks who remember the 1990s, and how apocalyptic that was. You have the Branch Davidians, you have Y2K, you have all this stuff, you have Heaven's Gate. It was a very apocalyptic time. We'll take that and turn it up to 50. And that gives you somehow crazily apocalyptic the 17th century was. So this is part of a much bigger apocalyptic messianic themes are all about the end of the world. To give it a sense of that, I want to read a letter of Nathan of Gazi here, just a chunk of a letter from Nathan of Gazi. And I'll read it relatively briefly, just so you know kind of what the mood felt like. This is a letter of Nathan of Gaza to Raphael Joseph, who was the Chalebi of a big wig dude in Cairo. In fact, he was the guy that gave Shabbatai shot. So I'm reading the translated lines of Nathan of Gaza. Quote, nowadays, we again face opposing forces. They are wholly ineffective, however, and injure no one but themselves, for the final end is now upon us. Again, the apocalyptic level, the final end is now upon us. This being so, it writes, you must not wonder why, by what special merit our generation has come to deserve it. In addition, there are these dreadful agonies, inconceivable and limitless, that Rabbi Shabbatai Tzvi has suffered on behalf of the Jewish nation. Consequently, he has full power to do with this nation whatever he pleases, to justify or condemn them. He may just depraved sinner in existence, even someone like Jesus, or condemn anyone who doubts him, even if he be the most pious person alive, to unspeakable torments. You must treat the following principle as absolutely certain. The Jewish people cannot attain to life other than by believing these things without any sign or miracle. All this is God's purpose enacted in this generation, worthy to see redemption. You must have no concern whatever those who do not believe, even if they be your close personal friends. And then after that, what ends up happening is that Shabbatai describes the outline of what Nathan of Gaza thinks is going to be roughly a 100-year period in which everything else is going to go down. And you get a sort of timeline about how this thing is going to go down, how Shabbatai is going to go, all kinds of stuff. It's very, very bizarre. But anyway, that gives you some sense of the fervor that Nathan of Gaza puts on to all this. Now, as we mentioned, Shabbatai died, and so did Nathan of Gaza. In fact, after Shabbatai died, Nathan of Gaza kind of redoubles his, and he argues basically that Shabbatai kind of illusion, that Shabbatai is not dead, it's just hidden, right? That was an idea to be found also in Shia and Islam, that he was occulted, and at some point very, very soon, he would reveal himself in his full glory. Again, are they leaning on Christianity at some level here? It sounds like it. It sounds like very Christian, that he's just hidden. So this is a kind of, it's kind of Shia, kind of Ismaili, kind of Christian move, that Shabbatai is not dead, he's just hidden. Now, what ends up happening in all of this, right, is that there is something of a combination that's already happened in Shabbatai's life, or the end of his life. Some Sufi ideas have begun to enter the inner circle of Shabbatai's theology, and those Sufi Islamic ideas begin to form a kind of synthetic theology. And that synthetic theology allows for the idea that, again, Shabbatai might be occluded, he's actually not dead. And what we have is over and over these predictions that Shabbatai will appear on this year and this year, and of course he never does. And eventually he dies. Nathan of Gaza dies, and as soon as Nathan of Gaza dies, the movement immediately begins to fracture. Because of course, when you have Nathan of Gaza, who is probably one of the more talented Kabbalists of his day, unable to steer the movement via his theoretical Kabbalah, the movement begins to fall apart. And the first person to really pick up the reins of this movement will be Abraham Cardozo, himself a known believer in Shabbatai. He would travel the Eastern Mediterranean basin, but also through Europe. He would be proclaiming the gospel, so to speak, of Shabbatai's feet, and he was murdered in 1706. So he was a huge promulgator of Shabbatian doctrine until he was killed. Now, the other side of this is that once Shabbatai died, the women in the ranks, and again, is it surprising? No. Think about Jesus. The moment that Jesus died, who were the only people there? Was the women, right? We have the Marys, right? We have the women there. The men all scatter. And so women, in a big way, hold the reins of the movement very early on. And in fact, there's some really great studies about Shabbatian women prophets and how the Shabbatian women prophets really both made the movement work, but also held the movement after Shabbatai had died. Now you'll remember that Shabbatai died, and his second wife, Aisha, or Yocheved, she went by both names. Actually, Aisha, or Yocheved, declared that her younger brother, Rito, was in fact the reincarnation of Shabbatai's figure. So we have, again, is the use of Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea of soul roots, and Gilgul HaShemot, the idea of reincarnation, to show that there's a continuity of Shabbatai's soul. He's not dead, incarnated. He's reincarnated, of course, into the younger brother here of Aisha Yocheved. And what ends up happening in this whole process is that there is some pressure being put on these quasi-Shabbatian Jews, Muslims, that are there living in places like Salonika and in places around the Shabbatian movement. Remember that part of what happened with Shabbatai Tzvi is he was condemned for not being Muslim, exiled all the way in what is now Montenegro. And so some of the people around him that stayed around him, about 300 or so, these were Jewish believers in Shabbatai who would never get rid of them. And eventually, with Aisha's pressure, probably she's getting pressure from the Ottoman Empire, they converted. Right? We get a mass conversion of about 300 who converted to Islam in 1683. Years after Shabbatai died. Core of about 300 families, right, which is the size of basically the synagogue I grew up in, that core was going to form the core of the post-Shabbatian movement. And over around a century, right, we have about, that number grows to about 600 families, and over time, what would end up happening is in that time period, in the generation after Shabbatai's death, the new faith of the Shabbatian movement taking effect. And basically, the new faith looks something like this. There is a Torah that is composed of 18 laws. There are 18 laws that make up the Torah of the Shabbatian movement. They do not have relationship with Jews, and they have outward relationship with Muslims, marry with Muslims, and they don't bury their dead with Muslims. So they don't associate with the Jewish crowd, because obviously they're not Jews anymore. They're Muslims now. But what's important is they still follow an underground form of Judaism made up of 18 laws, and they only marry within their own ranks, and they only bury within their own ranks. And what ends up happening is this group of converted Muslim, Jew, Shabbatian people, they don't actually observe Islam completely, and they dissimulate. They lie about the degree to which they're really Muslims, and this actually has precedent in some lodges in the Sufi movement. This is an idea called taqiyya, not taqiyya, not the Hebrew word taqiyya. This is the idea of your Sufi beliefs. If those Sufi beliefs in physically endanger you. So what they're living is basically a dual life. They're living quietly as kind of Jews, but publicly they're living as Muslims. And they're still not quite Muslims, and they're still certainly not Jews. There's something else. And this something else is going to eventually evolve into its own religion. Now, inside of the movement, there are further fractures. The major fractures, and there's three major fractures within the Shabbatian movement that will occur. The first major fracture is that there's going to be a incarnation of so-called incarnation of Shabbat Tzvi and Berethia Russo, who's known as Osman Baba. He killed in 1720, which, by the way, is telling you how close getting to modernity by this point. And he's declared to be one of the really important, he's been declared to be the legitimate inheritor of the Shabbatian movement. He's a reincarnation of Shabbat Tzvi. So this is going into two different groups. The smaller movement, which is the Yaqub movement. The Yaqub movement is actually very close to Sunni Orthodox Islam in the Karakashi movement. And the Karakashi movement is going to be much more syncretistic with Judaism. It's going to maintain some relations with Judaism, but it's going to be much more heavily Sufi influenced. What's important to know about the Karakashi movement is that they're going to have missionaries. And those missionaries are going to be sent to Eastern Europe. Again, where is this movement developing? It's developing primarily in Salonika. It's developing in places like Montenegro. They're going to move their way into Central Europe, and eventually they're going to reach the core of Central Europe and the Podolia region in Poland. And as you probably know, the Podolia region in Poland is going to be absolutely core. There's going to be a third and final. This is the Kampanzi movement. This is the period. This is the group that rejects the whole reincarnation theory. They reject the idea that Osman Baba is in fact an incarnation of Shabbatai Tzvi, and they say that there have been no reincarnations of Shabbatai Tzvi, only Shabbatai Tzvi the Messiah, and this version, right, the Kampanzi movement is the idea that Shabbatai Tzvi is the form of the Messiah. That group, which is actually popular Mevlevi, which I imagine folks know that Mevlevi, right? Those are the whirling dervishes. These are the famous whirling dervishes in the Sufi movement. So they're very close to them in a lot of ways. It's that part of the Shabbatian movement that's going to go on to become the one that will survive in Turkey. That one will survive in Turkey. We'll talk about this in a minute. So by the early to the mid-18th century, these groups would become the core of what we call the Shabbatian movement in the Ottoman Empire. And collectively, they're referred to as Dunme. Right? Dunme. Now, this word actually means apostate, and many of them would not call themselves Dunme, but I would call them something like conversos or just Shabbatians, but the name Dunme is stuck. Now, you might be asking how many of these Dunme were there. Well, they had a bit of a problem in terms of growing themselves because they only married within their own family. They had all kinds of problems. So there were probably, we guess, or somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Dunme in the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century. So at the turn part of the 20th century, there were 20, 15, 10,000 of these Shabbatians living in the Ottoman Empire. They were practicing Jews of a very strange type. Well, they lived on the outside as Muslims, but on the inside they lived as a kind of Jew, and they were kind of accepted. Everyone knew, I think, that they weren't completely Muslim. Kind of knew they weren't Jews. They kind of did their own thing. They buried their own dead in their own graveyard. They only married each other. They lived in the same part of Salonika and eventually Istanbul. They were their own thing. And everyone at some level knew this. And the important about the Donmeh is that there are four that are known about them, is that they became very, very well educated and very, very wealthy. This is all often true for very tight communities, right? That is to say, they became skilled craftsmen, they became skilled tradesmen, and they kept their money indoors, and they become actually quite educated and quite wealthy. And they were some of the earliest Turks to turn toward the west of sort of modernization. And as the Ottoman Empire began to come apart, in some level, the core, the Young Turks. And the Young Turks, as you probably know, are the folks that led the modernizations of Turkey. They revitalized the Turkish language. And in many ways, they formed the core of the process in which Turkey would modernize. And in many ways, these Donmeh, which we now know the Donmeh, formed a pretty significant element of the Young Turk movement, which means they played a pivotal role in the Turkey as a modern nation. Now, that would all turn. In fact, I think I said this right. The first foreign ministry for the new government of Turkey would be a Karakashi. So the first foreign minister is a big deal. That's a high rank in the Turkish government. So now the problem with this is the country war on. Turkey and of course Israel came into loggerheads about all kinds of things. And what ended up happening was that there was a huge anti-Semitic backlash, and that anti-Semitic backlash caught the Donmeh. The Donmeh were thought of as secret Jews, and the idea they were secret is even more terrible because there were conspiracy theories and stuff that fled through Turkey. And so many of the Donmeh basically completely Judaism, and many of them just completely ceased being and became completely secular. They became completely secular. The question now these days, by the way, is: are there any Donmeh in Turkey at all? And we don't know. I think I mentioned this last time in my last lecture on the Shabbatians. I had a student in a class I taught on Shabbat Tzvi. She came from a Donmeh family, and she said that in Turkey that she would ask other people, and they would say, "Yeah, I come from a family of Karkeshi people, or I come from a family of Kompasi people, but no, I'm just a secular person. My father was secular. My grandfather may have visited, whatever, a tomb with someone, but no, there are no practicing Donmeh left in Turkey." The problem with this, of course, is we don't know, because part of what the Donmeh do is they don't tell anyone they practice. They practice this idea of takia, which means they don't make it public that they are, in fact, Shabbatians. So are there Shabbatians left in Turkey? Maybe. Probably not. They're probably extinct. Are there Donmeh families left in Turkey? Probably. Yeah, there definitely Donmeh families left in Turkey. But are there any practicing Shabbatians in Turkey? The data seem to indicate no. It seems to be an extinct religion. But I'm leaving the door open for the possibility that they're still over there, but I think that the odds of them actually surviving are pretty low. Some idea that the Donmeh, at some level, Shabbatianism continued to thrive and thrive all the way into at least the mid-20th century in Turkey, where it was kind of. Now, as I mentioned, right, the Karakashi sect, the sect that holds that Osman Baba is the reincarnation of Shabbat Tzvi, began to get some idea where we are. We're on 1720. That sect, the Karakashi, were much more willing to mix Judaism and Islam. And remember, it was that sect that sent the first Shabbatai missionaries into Eastern Europe. Now, you might wonder why no one listened to this in Eastern Europe. Why would Jews hear these guys out? Shabbatai's dead. He's been dead for generations. It was a huge disappointment. It was a disaster. This entire thing was a disaster. Why would any Jews listen to the idea of the Messiah, despite the fact that this entire disaster has happened? That news of Shabbatai's death actually happened really slow. It took a long time to get to Central Europe. And so unlike in the Ottoman Empire, where the news traveled very fast, by the time Central Europe, Poland, things were very slow. And frankly, people weren't terribly educated. Jews in Central Europe in the early 18th century, Jews in Central Europe in the late 17th century, the early 16th century, late 17th century, yeah, they're not terribly educated. This is a very, very rural, very superstitious, very mystically inclined group of people. Remember that the Judaism of the Ashkenaz have historically been very interested in the supernatural, very taken with those kinds of ideas. Secondly, knowledge of Kabbalah at that time was very, very piecemeal in that area. Now, knowledge of Kabbalah in other areas was much higher, but at this point, early on in late in the 17th century, knowledge of Kabbalah was very, very piecemeal, very fragmented. What's important to know about this is those people coming in, some of these Karakashi missionaries carrying the gospel of Shabbatai, had a much higher degree of Kabbalah education at some level than the local people did. So this is very impressive. Further, Orthodox Judaism in this region was much, much more oriented at the level of practice. What really mattered for these people, and this is true for many factions of Judaism, is it matters much more what you do at some level than what you believe. And so belief was a bit more weird. You could have a much more broader range of belief and still practice Judaism, kinds of things like werewolves, vampires, and stuff. And it's okay as long as you practice Judaism in a nominal way. And further, these communities were very precarious. You're talking about a place where during Shabbat, right before Shabbatai's life, he experienced a giant pogrom that killed 100,000 Jews probably, and this entire area was subject to constant problems with the local population, where there are constant pogroms. So there's also just a level of instability and fear and messianic claims in an environment where there is a kind of precarious existence are much more, they become much more tenable. It's much more easy to convince poor, uneducated people who live a precarious existence of the existence of a Messiah that will save them as opposed to other people. And again, that's true. We can see that playing itself out lots of times in history. When the Shabbatian movement landed in Central Europe, in general, it kind of took. And it's always going to kind of take in Central Europe. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, what's important to know about this is what ends up happening in the aftermath of Shabbatai's apostasy in 1666 is that most people deconvert. They rejected his messiahship. What typically happens in the Jewish world? Someone gets to be the Messiah, they don't follow the rules, we reject it. What ends up happening is that typically the rabbis that were almost always the Shabbatai people were the Messiah, or were the rabbis in local regions like Manasseh ben Israel, for instance, in Amsterdam, and Manasseh ben Israel, who was anti-Shabbatian the entire time, once the fervor of the Messianic movement ended, Manasseh ben Israel basically walked in and kind of shepherded them in the aftermath of this disaster. So in many ways, Amsterdam is really typical because Amsterdam was hotly Messianic, very Messianic, maybe one of the largest Messianic centers in the world. And then after the 1666 apostasy, people were really disappointed, and Manasseh ben Israel, the rabbi of the community there, was able to basically shepherd them through the disaster. What ended up happening, however, in Central Europe is that some of the rabbis affected or influenced by these missionaries, these learned rabbis continued to hold their faith in Shabbatai in private while implying it and remaining Orthodox. So we have people that are secretly maintaining some kind of Shabbatian ideas, and yet at the same time, publicly, they are not holding on to them in public. We call these people crypto-Shabbatians. And what ends up happening is that as Kabbalists make their way into Central Europe in the aftermath of Shabbatai, you can sort of imagine Shabbatai as the wave that reaches in, and that when Shabbatai brings, the Messiah claims of Shabbatai bring this wave into Central Europe, what gets left behind after he leaves, after he sort of washes out, his Messianic plans wash out, what gets left behind is so he brings in the Kabbalah, and then because he's apostated or whatever, and what's left behind is the Kabbalah. And so as he leaves behind, as the movement leaves behind these Kabbalistic traces, the rabbis who are left behind with the belief in Shabbatai as the Messiah continue to believe in Shabbatianism as a Messianic movement, all the while still holding on to many of these Kabbalistic ideas, and it's the Kabbalistic ideas that still need to convince that he is in fact the Messiah, that maybe he is occulted, maybe he is actually just diving himself into the deep recesses of the code, and that he will eventually redeem them somehow, right? This is all part of the plan. Happening is that very early Kabbalah in Central Europe is always at some level tinged with the Shabbatian element. All of Kabbalah in Central Europe in the early 18th century, late 17th century is going to be tinged with Shabbatian element. And there are a lot of crypto-Shabbatian works, right? Shem.im, Shem.sar. We have other kinds of texts that are incredibly influential. We'll talk about that influence in just a minute. And this ultimately erupts in the Emden Ibishur controversy. And the Emden Ibishur controversy is a situation where two very, very, very prominent rabbis One of them, Ivashutz, is declared to be a Shabbatian. He's declared to be a crypto Shabbatian. And he denies it. He says, no, I'm not, no, I'm not, no, I'm not.
Dude, we got subscribers.
It was not settled in their lifetime. Both Emden and Ivashutz eventually died. And for a long time, people believed that Emden's critique of Ivashutz was that he was not really a Shabbatian. Now we know he probably was. We actually have good now that he was in fact a Shabbatian, crypto Shabbatian. In fact, to this day, it's not even clear who was and who wasn't. We still don't know who was a Shabbatian and who wasn't at this time period. And this is not good. This would be a minor issue if it weren't for the emergence of the most important Jewish movement in basically the modern period. And that movement, of course, is Hasidism. And so in many ways, the disdain between the Shabbatians, the crypto Shabbatians and their condemners is also going to track to the rise of Hasidism and the Mitnagdim, the people that condemn them, the opponents of the Mitnagdim in the century that comes later. Now, I'm going to make some really controversial statements that will make people who are very amenable to Hasidism maybe a little upset, but the data is now showing, evidence is now showing that early Hasidism, there is a relationship there. It's obscure and it's difficult, but there are many overlapping elements of both early Hasidism and European Shabbatianism that it's, I think, undeniable that its movement, the Hasidic movement, at some level, is at least influenced by Shabbatianism. I don't want to say an outgrowth of Shabbatianism. I don't think that's true. But the idea that they're completely distinct, I think, is no longer holdable by the Hasidic movement. But I think it's there. So, why do I, for instance, things like the role of the Tzaddik or the Rebbe, the idea that they're a sort of intermediary, kind of quasi-messiah, as sort of an intermediary between them and God. The Rebbe is often sometimes thought of engaging in transgression for the sake of heaven. This idea that they suffer on behalf of the community, for the community. The emergence of both of these movements, the Shabbatian movement and the movement, both emerge in the exact same region of Poland, the Podolia region. The Baal Shem Tov is from there. We'll talk about Hasidism next time, but I'm just saying at this point, I do think that the Hasidic have, that there's some, both of them are very influenced by Kabbalah, Lorrainic Kabbalah. There's an antinomian streak in Hasidism, obviously, you can find that in Shabbatianism as well. There's this stuff about Bagashmiut, the sort of physical stuff that the Hasidim do that also seems to be also with some Shabbatianism as well, although typically the Hasidic movement is largely halachically Jewish law-wise, very conservative, but there's still an antinomian streak, and there's even legal innovations in Hasidism that are not to be found in the Misnag movement. For instance, the wearing of tefillin during Chol Moed, that is deeply influenced by Allah. It's not to be found in more Litvak style Judaism. That's an element that comes especially in Hasidism. As you probably know, the world of Hasidism is very court-like. The Rebbe is treated almost as a kind of regal figure, as a kind of king, and there is a quasi-messianic attitude toward the Rebbes in the Hasidic movement. You know that Shabbatian texts played a huge role in the early Hasidism, especially from the Yamim, and in many ways, the Misnag movement, the Litvak movement, the movement that was very critical of Hasidism, saw in many ways Hasidism as a extension of the Shabbatian movement. And when the Vilna Gaon really goes after the early Hasid, he really claims that under the hood of it all is Shabbatianism, that they actually are Shabbatians. Now, I think that in general, does the Vilna Gaon overplay his cards? Maybe he does overplay his cards, but is he completely off base? I don't think so. It's not crazy and he's not a fool. I think he's not just being polemical or saying polemical. I don't think he's too trying to get people off. I think there's a relatively strong argument made that there is a strong influence of the Shabbatian movement, the crypto-Shabbatian movement in Central Europe, especially in the Podolia region, on early Hasidism. But we'll get to Hasidism. Now, in Podolia, the reason I just mentioned in Poland, this movement continues to change and it continues to mutate, and it will mutate into perhaps its most absolutely bizarre form of Jacob Frank. Born into a Shabbatian family, he left Podolia to move to the Ottoman Empire. He joined up with the Karkashi sect. In fact, Osman Baba was a witness at his wedding in 1752. 1752, folks. We're in 1752, FYI. Like, this is 25 years or so until, the American Revolution. So he moves back to Podolia, and he begins to practice a kind of quasi-transgressivism, and we have what is called the Lion Scrum Affair, where it seems like in a synagogue, he may have had a naked who was called the embodiment of the Torah, and they were doing some kind of stuff in the synagogue, dancing around this naked woman who was thought to be the embodiment of the Torah. And in 1751, him and his were excommunicated by the local rabbis. Now, there is an idea to Frankism and Shabbatianism, which is called mitzvah haba'ah ba'avera. This is sometimes translated as redemption through sin, but this is a complete misreading of what's going on in Shabbatianism. In fact, almost everybody who totes this idea, I think, is misguided. This idea of redemption through sin, that you have to become redeemed, this idea never, to my knowledge, any Shabbatian writing. It gets hoisted onto the Shabbatians over and over again, that what they're doing is engaging in violations of the Jewish law in order to hasten redemption, in order to plunge themselves into the klipot and redeem the klipot, in order to somehow redeem sin through, or redeem themselves through sin. There's just virtually no evidence of this. Shabbatai Tzvi never makes that argument, neither does Nathan of Gaza. This term, mitzvah haba'ah ba'avera, which is an idea actually found in the Talmud, has to do with can you do mitzvah with a forbidden object? So the classic example is, can you wave a stolen lulav? And the rabbi said no. Right? You can't commit a mitzvah by breaking another mitzvah. And so even the idea of this is just ridiculous, and unfortunately it's gotten promulgated by anti-Semites and stuff, who have these vast conspiracy theories that somehow all of modern Jews, or all kinds of people, George Soros or whatever, that these people are somehow part of this lineage of the Rothschilds and all this stuff, and they're really secret engaged in horrifying sins. It's just ridiculous, and unfortunately it's gotten promulgated by anti-Semites who have these vast conspiracy theories that somehow all of modern Jews, or all kinds of people, George Soros, or people are somehow part of this Frankist lineage of the Rothschilds and all this stuff, and that they're really secret Frankists, and they're engaged in horrifying sins, and the more sin they do, they can redeem themselves. And so there's this entire anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is rooted in the idea of the Frankists and the Shabbatians practicing this idea of mitzvah haba'ah ba'avera, but the truth of the matter is they never did this, and that was not what they were up to. And I would say that anyone who wants to believe in this, just show me in the Shabbat literature where this idea is put forward. I don't know that it ever is. I can't find a single thing. What Frank does argue is that what's happening is that he is inaugurating a new Torah. That the new Torah he is inaugurating is a placement, right? So you have the Torah Beriyah, and he's inventing a new Torah. He's conjuring into being a new Torah, the Torah Atzilut, the Torah of this world. And that new Torah is going to inaugurate a new religion that he calls Da'at, wisdom, knowledge. Das is how you would say it in Ashkenazi. This idea, he's bringing a new form of the Torah to the world, and that new form of the Torah is going to be this thing that he calls a new religion called Da'at, or Das. After, we'll go to this relatively, what is happening is that Frank and his followers are arrested, and they flee to Istanbul to convert to Islam, like many Frankists or many Shabbatians at the time. And what they end up doing is sort of making a deal with the devil. And by the devil, I mean here Catholic bishops. And what they end up doing is they argue that they represent a camp of Jews who are influenced by the Zohar, who reject the Talmud, and that the other camp, the anti-Shabbatians, the anti-Frankists, accept the Talmud but reject the Zohar. Now, of course, the Jews accepted both, and the Shabbatians are trying to parlay with the Catholic Church, basically, so that the local Jewish population can't basically condemn them. Shabbatians argue with the rabbis. It's a 19 to 40 debate, and the bishop is the bishop is the person who's going to side with, and the bishop obviously sides with the Shabbatians and against the Talmudists, and the Talmud is condemned, and there are dozens of copies of the Talmud burned in Poland. Now, what ends up happening, again, history is always funny, the bishop that sided with the Shabbatians in Poland in 1757, he dies, and a new bishop emerges who is no longer a friend of the Shabbatians. At this point, Frank declared the reincarnation of Osman Baba and Shabbatai Tzvi, and he begins to reveal his name. And what ends up happening after that is that, oh man, this gets so complicated. There's a local bishop who wants to prove, and in order to prove the blood libel, Jews sacrifice and kill the host, sort of classic anti-nonsense. He holds another dispute in Lvov in 1759 of the blood libel, but the anti-Talmudists are declared to be not really Jews, and they are to be converted. And Nathan and Frank, on September 1759, basically sides with this bishop and stands to gain an enormous amount. Also, the Jews, including Frank, also stand an enormous amount of privilege by converting to Catholicism. 3,000 Jews are converted to Catholicism on the 17th of September 1759. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. I don't think Frank himself even thought this was going to happen. Frank, being, I think, completely full of himself, and I think just delusional with power.
93 days of fellowship.
This is part of the plan. Just like Shabbatai had to convert to Islam, well, from the reincarnation, Shabbatai Tzvi and Osman Baba, he's going to himself plunge himself into the world of Catholicism. And after he converts, he lived the life of a Polish noble. He lived the life of a Polish noble. He's wearing fine clothes, doing all this stuff, but at the same time, he is also engaged in very, very heterodox behavior. And in a way that the Turkish court would accept Shabbatai engaging in very strange behavior, the local Catholics aren't having it. They are not having it. Eventually, they arrest Frank, and he is basically sent upstairs for 14 years. So he's arrested and sent to a monastery for 14 years. I don't want to deal with him. The Catholics are not playing around, perhaps in the way that the Turks were. In 1772, Russian forces invade Poland, and they release him. They actually release him from this monastery where he's being kept, and he kind of cozies up to members of the Holy Roman Empire. He gets comfortable with Joseph II. He meets Paul I, the fourth of Russia, and it's in that time period that he writes his principal Frankist Shabbatian work, a text called The Collection of the Words of the Lord, which is published now. What's happening is that he gets into kerfuffle with Joseph II, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He's expelled from the court, and he ends up settling, and eventually he dies of a stroke in 1791. 1790, in the middle of the French Revolution at this point, right? 1789, we're just not far out from the terror. At that point, about 1791, his daughter, Ava, takes control of the movement. Again, it's women who rescue this movement. There are about 25,000 Frankists. That is to say, Catholics living as crypto-Jews in Poland in the late 18th century. And what ends up happening is Ava Ava Frank leads the movement into the future, basically building a giant court around her. She actually claims that she's the daughter of all these Russian royalty or whatever. And there is a huge Shabbatian center in both Warsaw and Prague, both under her control. And she lives like a princess, folks. I mean, people, like, the amount of money that she spent to maintain her lifestyle basically bankrupted the movement. And when she died in September of 1816, the movement was so heavily indebted that it began to collapse under its own weight. I mean, she lived like in the areas that she lived in. By the 1880s, we know that the movement sort of limped, although many people at that point had begun to realize that just being Catholic is a better idea than trying to maintain this bizarre double life. And so many people who began to convert and began to be Catholic, just continue to be Catholic. And by the 1880s, we have very little evidence that people are practicing crypto Judaism anymore. They're no longer Shabbatians, but they're still very emotionally connected to Ava Frank. In fact, Ava Frank became sort of a cult of personality all of her own, and it became less about Shabbatai Tzvi and less about Nathan, less about Frank and more about her and her cult of personality. And what we end up having is people basically by the 1880s have largely converted to basically just regular Catholicism. Although some people deconvert. Some people deconvert and go back to Judaism. So there's a bit of a split there. And the evidence that split, you may know this family. It's a very Catholic family that becomes a pretty famous Catholic person. I'm trying to pronounce their name wrong, but you probably recognize the Voila family, right? You probably know who that is. That's the family of John Paul II. That's the family of John Paul II. There is good evidence, good reason to believe that the former Pope, John Paul II, is a descendant of one of the converted Frankish families, right? Now, that's the side that became Catholic. Obviously, John Paul II is pretty Catholic, and he's from one of these Frankish families. On the other side, another group of families deconvert. They go back to Judaism, and a kind of liberal Judaism, a kind of Turkish-style Judaism, like the Young Turks. A very liberal, progressive form of Judaism is the Brandeis. And of course, the Brandeis, as you may know, Louis Brandeis became the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And when Louis Brandeis died, when they were going through his effects, one of the things they found in his family inheritance was an image, a picture of Ava Frank. He came from a Frankish family, heirloom. Now, does that mean that Louis Brandeis was a Frankist and a crypto Shabbatian, blah, 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 blah? No. He probably was a liberal Jew, just like many liberal Jews that you recognize from lots of places anywhere in the States at the time. But he maintained an image, a picture of Ava Frank, and he comes from a Frankist family. Do I think he was a practicing Shabbati in any form or fashion? Absolutely not. It's ridiculous any more than I think that John Paul II was a practicing Frankist. Although, what I want to point out here as I wrap up the night, Frankism, Shabbatianism had a huge impact on the development of Judaism. Huge impact. You can't study Kabbalah until you're 40 and married and all that. That's a response to the Frankists, to the Shabbatian movement. The internal realities in Central Europe, the rise of Hasidism, is probably at some level of this movement, a part of it, or at least a Shabbatian, an expression of a kind of Shabbatianism. The intense hatred of the Hasidic movement by the Misnagdim is probably part of their anti-Shabbatian movement. And again, we have prominent families who emerged in the aftermath of the disaster of Shabbatianism and Frankism, both in the rise of the world of Turkey, the rise of the Young Turks, and the rise of the Turkish national movement. And then we have families who are very prominent Polish families, like the family of John Paul II and the family of Louis Brandeis, who ultimately emerged from the Frankist movement, from the Shabbatian movement, and are part of world history in a big way. There are even neo-Shabbatians. In fact, my channel, there's a couple of folks who are neo-Shabbatians. I expressed the idea that Shabbatianism was a disaster for Judaism. I'm not going to apologize for that. I think it was a catastrophe. But I think if someone finds Shabbat to be an interesting spiritual figure, it's better for them. But hammer home tonight as I wrap up this lecture tonight is that we cannot imagine Judaism coming into modernity without Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai Tzvi is the bridge in many ways of Judaism from the world of the medieval world, the medieval Kabbalah, and he is the bridge to modernity. Hasidism, the Haskalah, Zionism, all of that at some level has to be seen as in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi, as in the shadow of the Shabbati movement. All of the Messianic stuff in the Lubavitch movement, Judaism, all of it. At some level, it is in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi. And there's no way that we can deny it, I don't think. And so, in many ways, if you want to understand modern Judaism, you have to understand it at some level a response to the Shabbati movement. And in that way, Shabbatai Tzvi is still around because in many ways we are living in the shadow cast by this peculiar Messiah who apostatized to Islam and continued to be Jewish or something. So to drive this point home and to put a fine point on it tonight as we wrap up, modernity, Jewish modernity, is in many ways in the shadow of Shabbatai Tzvi. And the more we learn about him, the more we understand him, the more we understand this moving after him, whether it is the fractures in his death or the Frankist movement or what have you, but better understand Jewish order modernity, whether it be the Hasidic movement, Ismaili, whatever. They're all in the shadow. And I think it's quintessentially important to understand him, of Gaza, the theology, the Kabbalah, in many ways, downstream of him. And so, Shabbatai Tzvi, a Messiah, in a lot of ways, I think of Judaism in some ways, a pre-modern Judaism between two Messiahs, and that's Nazareth Shabbatai Tzvi. You can bookmark Judaism in some ways, medieval, ancient Judaism between those two bookmarks. And that modernity is in the aftermath of the shadow. So, if you're not, whether you're embarrassed of him or not, whether you think he's crazy or not, whatever, you certainly can't deny, I don't deny that we have not, as a Jewish population, come into a real grasp of the impact. I think that we're worse off for that. I think the better we understand Shabbatai Tzvi and his movement and its vicissitudes, the better we will understand the better we understand Jewish fraternity, we will understand Zionism, all of that. And if we don't do that, it's our Welcome back, and thank you for joining me.
You're fired. Go fuck yourself.